Hi, I want to talk to you about the Year 11 Religion and Ethics task for the unit The Australian Scene, which you are currently studying. The Australia that you're growing up in is so different in so many ways to the Australia I grew up in back in the 1960s and 1970s that it almost occurs to me that we've almost grown up in different countries, you and I. When I was a teenager, pretty much if we talked about religious diversity, we were talking about Catholics as opposed to Anglicans. Today it's a very, very different world in terms of the religious groups that exist within Australia. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, if we were talking about fast food, takeaway, that kind of thing, we would have been talking about a trip to the fish and chip shop. And if we were really exotic, we might have gotten a Chico roll or maybe, just maybe, a kebab, but that would have been it. In the 1970s, a number of people came to Australia, largely as victims of war from places such as Vietnam. And many of these people who came here were not Christian. So one of the things that happened was not only did our food tastes begin to change in the sense of some of the restaurants that started to open up, but the number of religions in Australia grew very, very significantly. So this unit asks you to consider the question, can religious diversity advance Australia fair? Now that's a fancy way of asking you whether or not you think the number of people from different religions in this country help to make Australia a better place. That's really what the question's asking you to explore. The method of presenting this assignment is by way of a PowerPoint presentation with a minimum of 10 slides. So what I want to do in this video is just talk through the suggested slides that you might like to consider putting together as you respond to this task. The first slide, as with any PowerPoint presentation, would be a title slide that clearly indicates the topic, can religious diversity advance Australia fair? So think about what might be appropriate on the title slide. There's all different sorts of religions in Australia these days. Obviously we have Christians, we have Jewish people, we have Hindus, we have Buddhists, we have Muslims. So maybe on your title page you might look at having photos, images of people from those different religious traditions. You might have a map of Australia. The title page is really only going to be limited by your own creativity. On the next slide, the second slide we want to be about who calls Australia home. Now, in the first week or so of this term, you actually put together a graph where you looked at the different religious groups that exist in Australia. So on this particular slide, you would put that graph into the PowerPoint and you might make a couple of comments. Which is the biggest religious group in Australia, the largest religious group? Which is the smallest? That's what the second slide would be about. The third slide asks you to consider, what does being Australian mean to you? Now, one of the other things that we've done is we've had a look at the Australian citizenship test. So you can see the sorts of questions that people who come here from other countries have to answer before they can actually be considered to be Australian. On this slide, on the third slide, we want you to think about what is it that's different about being Australian to being, say, Chinese or American? What are the things that set us apart as a people? And again, there's a variety of things that you could do there by way of images, maybe it might be some poetry. There's a variety of things that you might want to put into that third slide that says something about what Australian means to you. On the fourth slide, we'd like you to consider, how does being religious square with being Australian? Because sometimes Australians are not considered to be very religious people. And yet when we have bushfires, when we have floods and sort of natural disasters of any kind, I would say we see a real Australian spirituality come through. And it's a spirituality that has as its heart a concern for our neighbour, a concern for people that are less well off than we are. But have a little bit of a think about what role does religious experience have in being Australian? Maybe it's not as institutional as some other countries in the world, but maybe there are particular things that, being an Australian spirituality, that again set us apart from other people. On your fifth slide, you might want to think about how well does Australia handle religious diversity? Now again, you might be wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, if we think over the last 10 years or so, religious groups that have come here from other countries don't necessarily get an easy time in Australia. There have certainly been instances where mosques have been firebombed and other people who clearly come from other countries have been persecuted because of how they look. So how well do you think Australia handles religious diversity? And you might need to go to some newspapers to have a look at stories that might exist about what happens with regard to how those people are treated. The sixth slide, which we suggest that you put together, talks about how and when did these different religions arrive in Australia. So this really is just simply a timeline. Again, using the internet as your best friend with this particular slide, have a bit of a look at when particular religions first arrived in this country. And I'm sure your teachers will be able to assist you in terms of finding some of that information out. We would particularly like you to think about who would be some of the early Catholic pioneers in this country. Who are some of the people in the Catholic Church who made the Catholic people in this country what we are today? That would be important. And then, what do you think religion might look like in Australia in the future? How would it be different? There's some of the things we'd like you to consider on the sixth slide. On the seventh slide, it would be a good idea to look at how does the media treat the whole question of religious diversity. So, for example, when people such as Muslims are presented in the media, are they presented in a positive way? Often they're presented in ways that are quite negative, and in turn this then creates a prejudice against people from particular religious traditions. So in that slide you might have an example, it might be a short clip that you find on YouTube that you can include to talk about how the media treats people from other religious traditions who live in Australia. On the eighth slide, I'd be suggesting that you look at the question of whether or not some of the traditional Australian concepts such as mateship, having a fair go, she'll be right, the battler and the underdog, whether or not some of these concepts actually have a spirituality that lies beneath them. So is there something there? So if you go to the Gospel, for example, the Gospel will talk about Jesus' love for people who were poor, Jesus' love for people who were outcasts in their society. When we look at some of the people who Australians admire, they're not necessarily the high flyers. They're the people who in many ways have done it tough. So when we look at that, are there aspects of a spirituality that again we can identify? And we'd like you to think about that. So there's 8 slides that I suggest you put together. The task sheet has another 6 possibilities that you might want to consider. And I'd really like you, depending on your own level of interest and concerns, I'd like you to consider what you might want to choose for those last 2 slides. It's an interesting unit and it's an important one because it's the Australia that we live in and it's the Australia that you as young people will be shaping into the future. So I'll leave you with the question, can religious diversity advance Australia fair? Good luck with your investigations.